Schiller. I'm studying biology. I was a delegate to COP 28 in the UAE last year, and I had the pleasure of working with the COP 29 delegation this year. They're all incredible people, so I'm really excited for you to hear about their experiences. And thank you so much for joining us for the panel today. So we can start with introductions. Do you want to go down the line? Maybe name, hometown, year, what you're studying.
Yes, okay. Is this okay? My name is Leanne Tam. I'm a senior at BC, and I'm studying global public health with a minor in studio art, and I'm from a suburb of Chicago.
I'm Sangeeta. I'm a second year at the law school, and I'm from Princeton, New Jersey.
Hi guys, I'm Jinsu. I'm a junior here, studying economics and environmental studies from Seoul, South Korea.
Hello everyone, my name is Ahmed Fajani. I am a second year MBA MSF student here at the Carroll School of Management, and I'm originally from Denver, Colorado.
So what led you guys to apply to be delegates to COP, just based on your experiences, interests, just out of curiosity?
Can I start? Okay.
Yeah.
So I started at BC as a pre-med student and then slowly transitioned into the public health program. And through my experiences like working in hospitals and then kind of seeing the more upstream policy side of things, I really became passionate about creating more change through policy and like on the more primary primordial side of things. So I really wanted to go to COP to see how they create policy that's like global governance to try to combat climate change, and really wanted to be involved in that experience because I possibly want to follow a career in medicine.
So prior to coming to law school, I studied international relations. I went to USC, Southern California, not South Carolina, and focused on international development and sustainability policy. And coming to law school, I knew I wanted to work in human rights and climate change in some fashion. And so following COP negotiations for most of my academic career thus far, it did dawn on me that I was studying a lot from other people's perspectives and other people's reflections of what's happening in the negotiating level, and being able to have that firsthand experience would be essential, especially from a lawyer perspective of understanding procedures and the dynamics between the various stakeholders. So that's why, yeah.
I've always been interested in corporate sustainability and business ethics, and as an economics major, I felt like COP29 was a unique COP in that we were talking about how to mobilize finance to fund global climate funds. So that sort of piqued my interest and led me to apply. And I also have experience with COP26 in Glasgow. I participated sort of back in high school, but it was during COVID. So I was sort of really intrigued at the opportunity to actually go in person and sort of be in the midst of everything and really absorb the new innovations and attend pavilions and negotiations and things like that. Yeah.
For me, I studied mechanical engineering in my undergrad, and I got some exposure to renewable energies my last semester at Colorado Boulder, and kind of piqued my interest within green hydrogen. And as I transitioned here, I heard about COP29. Sounds really cool with the finance, coming from an MBA standpoint, learning about negotiations and kind of the high level. That was a good opportunity for me to sit in and get exposed to something at the UN level.
So you all have very different backgrounds. You know, you're coming from public health, law, economics, engineering. So, and Jen, so you've been to COP26 before, which is, you know, a very exciting perspective to bring going into COP29. So what was your favorite part of COP29 when you were there?
I think for me, my favorite part of COP29 is being able to see the perspective, especially from people from Caribbean nations, the small island nations. We spoke to delegates from Fiji and got to hear, at least for me, a lot of female perspectives and a lot of indigenous perspectives. And I think at COP it can get very overwhelming, especially with the bigger nations kind of controlling the negotiations a lot of the time. And being able to go to those talks and hear their perspective, I think, is very important, especially from a health equity and justice perspective. So that was very uplifting, and even though I feel like their nations are in kind of the toughest situations, they brought a lot of hope to the situation. So that's the best part for me.
I think going off of what Leanne was saying, the COP negotiations are very vast, and you see a lot of different people and perspectives coming into the room. And while we were at COP, we saw a protest happening about divesting from fossil fuels, and I thought that was very interesting to see, because I think a lot of the origins of climate policy and climate change action through the formal negotiation process actually started with social activism and environmental justice movements. And so I think it was interesting to still see that voice being present. I think there are obviously challenges with balancing some of those larger state perspectives dominating the conversation, but I think it was an interesting connection between all these various voices in climate.
For me personally, I think I enjoyed attending the pavilions the most. So at COP26, I attended on Zoom, so it was sort of like a different experience walking around, networking with people. But what really stood out to me was how within the pavilions, all of these different countries, businesses, and organizations were presenting new innovations and ideas to sort of tackle climate change, whether it be mobilizing new climate schemes or coming up with new technology ideas. And for somebody interested in how things like investment and how corporate structures can drive positive change, it was really uplifting for me to see all these different countries and organizations working together to sort of share what they've been working on, not just within themselves, but with each other, and sort of creating that synergy within one area was super interesting for me to see that.
So he stole my answer. Same thing. I love the pavilions. The opportunity at the UN, you kind of get the global scale of the negotiations, sitting in on talks and different conversations. But really, when you get to the pavilions, you get that one-on-one with different countries and different ambassadors and what they're hoping to get out of the UN. So for me, I really enjoy being within the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Oman. These are countries that are naturally just fossil fuels, oil states, and seeing how they're trying to slowly start transitioning away from COP28, which is what Essential was a part of. So it was really cool to like sit there and actually hear from them, be like, oh, this is what we're doing, these are the efforts we're making. It was a cool opportunity to be part of that.
No, I think so. As some of you may know, COP is the International Climate Conference that brings a lot of countries together and provides a space for negotiations. But something that a lot of people don't necessarily talk about is just how much of a hub for climate action it is. So like they were talking about, there's beyond just rooms for negotiations, you have a lot of pavilions and a lot of rooms that are set up for other kinds of meetings that bring together, non-profit organizations that are somewhat connected with the government, private organizations, to really talk about like sustainability initiatives that they're taking, bring up problems, like raise voices, say like indigenous voices, or like there's a lot of youth climate forums, discussions on, how maybe women are more vulnerable. So really it is like a very overarching, hub for climate action, which I think is super, super cool. So what is something that you learned that surprised you? Because I remember when I went to COP28, I think something that really took me aback was how much like language mattered, and like how small linguistic changes in certain words like actually made such a huge impact. Like I saw for 10 minutes people debate like whether they should change acknowledge to recognize in a certain draft text, which really didn't have a lot of meaning for me, but clearly seemed to mean something to them. So what are some things that surprised you guys when you were there that you weren't necessarily expecting?
I didn't have a lot of experience with like finance or economics before going in, so I feel like I learned a lot about the carbon markets especially and how those worked. And I think something that really surprised me was just the vastness of conversations around the carbon markets, because some people were saying that they were championing the carbon markets and they're a step in the right direction, while other people were saying that carbon markets are taking away indigenous land. So I really think not knowing a lot about economics going in and like this being the finance COP and them really focusing on economic solutions, just kind of how some delegates were really supporting these things while other people were trying to bring in a justice perspective, and I really thought that dichotomy was interesting and very eye-opening.
I think similar to the point that Sancha just raised, I was surprised by how the pace of the negotiations were moving and sort of the strategy around it. I think when we first got there, they had passed these global carbon market rules. They were operationalizing the loss and damage fund, but it seemed as though the rest of the negotiations, especially the ones that we were in the room for, things would move extremely slowly. And I think I had that perspective coming in from the law that things do move really slowly, and there are a lot of just procedural things you have to get through, but I guess I came in with the perspective thinking that you only have 2 weeks altogether. Wouldn't this move a little faster? But there was a lot of bureaucratic standstill and just these little minute details that you wouldn't think they would get caught up into given, the larger urgency of the situation. But I think a large number of the discussions we attended were, political blocs delaying the conversation or kind of disagreeing, agreeing with each other, but not really moving the conversation forward.
Yeah, I think what surprised me the most was how much the host country matters. This is a sort of concept we've been talking about the entire semester. But Azerbaijan is a petrostate, and it's really interesting because oil and these natural gases are considered an important cultural and religious sort of symbol for abundance and prosperity. So COP being held at a petrostate definitely has its implications. When we were at the Green Zone, we definitely saw a lot of coverage for local oil companies. I forget the name of the main one. SOCAR, I think. Yeah. And that just raises more questions for me, right? Because COP30 is going to be in Brazil. What are the implications of that? So yeah, I think that sort of host country dynamic, also with the geopolitics in the region, really stood out to me.
You're not taking my answers, man. Unbelievable.
Go first. Next time you go first.
We can hop around.
I like this guy.
We can hop around.
No, I think similar to your point, my favorite thing was learning about Azerbaijan, just seeing how they held the conference itself. If I had to come up with my second favorite thing, was really sitting in and having those conversations with the delegates in the blue zone. Like you're just walking by, you just like walk by like the prime minister of some country, be like, oh, hello, I had the opportunity with Vida in the back that we sat down. We actually got to talk with some the Brazilian delegates just having lunch on the side, and it was shocking. They were talking about how excited they were for next year and how they were stressed about things that they got to start planning for now. And it was really cool to sit there and be like upfront and personal.
So Jinsu, you actually brought up a very interesting point about the host country and how it influences dynamics and negotiations, because that's definitely something I observed at COP28 too when we were in the UAE. There definitely, again, also Petro said, and there definitely were talks of, are there background deals that are going on right now? And this is the 3rd year in a row that COP has been hosted in a country that is known for its fossil fuel use or for being a petrostate, because COP27 was in Egypt, COP28 was UAE, and then COP29 was Azerbaijan. And the choice of host country definitely raised eyebrows this year too, because it did come after a lot of political attention. The Eastern European countries were supposed to elect one country unanimously to host COP29, and they didn't really come to an agreement till the end of COP28, which usually most countries have a longer period of time to figure out who's hosting, how to organize things. So just based on your experience there, I'd love to hear some of your other experiences too about, what was Baku like and what was it like visiting Azerbaijan during COP? And do you think you'd have a different perception of Azerbaijan when you visited outside of the COP period?
I think definitely it was a very strange experience inside and outside the conference. We were able to meet some Azerbaijani citizens that were able to come into the green zone, and they told us a lot about how the whole city of Baku was kind of shut down for this conference and deep cleaned, and jobs and schools were canceled, and everyone was kind of focused on making this conference work and kind of making Baku beautiful for all the people that were visiting their city, and I think they're really using it as kind of like a tourist attraction to create more of a tourist economy in their country. And then inside the conference, especially the Green Zone, because Azerbaijan was running the Green Zone while the UN runs the Blue Zone, there was a lot of greenwashing, as Jungsu mentioned. There were many industries there. There are energy industries, there are oil industries, and they're all there. I think one moment specifically, we were at the energy station, and they had this large map of where they had like all their solar and renewable energy projects, and all of them were in the regions where the Armenian genocide continues to stay. And I think that's just a great example of greenwashing in their country, is like they're having these renewable good projects that they're trying to promote in a region of conflict. And additionally, we spoke to the woman there, and I was asking her questions about how they're planning on transitioning to renewable energy, and because their country is so reliant on oil and fossil fuels, how there's kind of creating this balance. And she told us how they need to continue to rely on fossil fuels for years to come, and they will never transition fully into renewable energy because their country is so reliant on it, and instead they're exporting it to other countries like European nations. But they were really pushing for fossil fuels to kind of be the next stage of climate change, instead of phasing out of fossil fuels, like really pushing for the importance of fossil fuels to be within that transition. And I think that was just really interesting perspective to have in the climate conference when something so urgent is happening. So yeah, as someone spending a lot of time in the Green Zone, we were there. I feel like that was a very important experience.
That's definitely interesting. I think like I remember the UAE also having similar messaging where they said we definitely want to do what aligns with the best science, and that was the main messaging that they were pushing, like we need to get to the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark while doing what aligns with the best science, except it was like sublettering where the best science didn't necessarily involve reducing fossil fuel use, which was definitely an interesting perspective like here about.
Yeah, so I think prior to coming to Azerbaijan and knowing that it was a Petra state, nonetheless I think I thought it was a good move in a sense, because theoretically the countries that are already invested in the climate cause are are part of this process, have been engaged in this process, and to get down to 1.5 degrees Celsius or to net zero, it's empowering these countries that feel like it's not feasible to divert away from fossil fuels and transition. So I thought it would signal something positive in terms of empowering these traditional Petra states to do that. But I think once I was in Azerbaijan, maybe I was naive, or it was a little bit of, there was some will there to, start some of these renewable projects and have some of these traditional oil companies start to move towards renewable energy, but it did give off the impression of political opportunism, in the sense of this is a great opportunity to put Azerbaijan on the map, not necessarily as a climate haven, but as a place for people to come visit. And there was a big Azerbaijani tourism pavilion, if you could call it, in the middle of the Green Zone. It's the largest pavilion there, where rather when some of the renewable energy ones are kind of tucked away towards the back. So I think it was a little bit of a wake-up call, in the sense of it's inspiring to see that a lot of countries are getting involved in countries that are traditionally not part of environmental causes, but it did seem on some level that Azerbaijan wasn't fully invested in the COP process for climate purposes, more so for their own political purposes.
Do you want to go first, or?
As soon as you say it, I swear to God.
I think for me, Baku was a beautiful city, rich, rich with history, and the food was amazing, and I think all of the great points were sort of covered. So I think, generally speaking, a question that I had personally leaving COP was one, Azerbaijan is a petrostate, and we mentioned that in the green zone we had a lot of maybe a little bit of greenwashing, maybe a lot of just coverage for local energy and oil companies, and sort of expanding from that. Excuse me, Azerbaijan had a lot of conflict with bordering countries like Armenia to the west. So a question I had was, if COP is being held at such a location, does that actually raise more awareness for these sort of domestic issues that are present, or does that actually provide them an opportunity for them to sort of mask what's happening in the back? So I think I'm sort of going into this whole new COP30 season with that new perspective that I gained from Baku, thinking about, okay, let's say there are like sort of procedural difficulties in Belen, or maybe like the infrastructure is not ready yet to host a big conference like COP. Maybe there are corruption issues. I don't know, I'm just naming examples. But does having COP actually sort of hide that from the sort of global viewpoint, or does it actually shed light on it? So I think that's my biggest takeaway from traveling around Baku, meeting people, things like that. I hope I didn't take
All of you took part of my answer, so it's absolutely fine. But I think the thing I want to focus on was, prior to this, we did have an opportunity to learn a bit more about the region in Azerbaijan. I was a little surprised, as Baku is known as Paris of the East, and when I went there, like the downtown area, I don't know how you guys felt, it felt a lot of like very nice architecture. I called it like Paris with a sprinkle of Dubai. And like the tall, amazing buildings and the amazing like infrastructure on the streets. So I was a little surprised by that, but I also was more surprised at how welcoming everybody was. Being from like the eastern region, like they usually have a culture that's more cold. Like I was watching a few YouTube videos, they said people don't really smile, people were smiling at me, I was like, this is awkward. But things like that. So it was really cool to be like sit there, be understanding of that, but people were very welcoming at the conference, and I was a surprise. I had the opportunity to go back the week after the conference to walk around the city a little bit more, so there was a very different kind of environment. It was a lot less busy for one, but also I feel like people there had like settled down, like conference is gone, we can actually go back to our standard lives. Like, it was a very drastically the difference, but it was still like kind of clean. So like I think either not that many people are walking by, they just kept it clean, or they're going to continue to do that. So I'd be curious to go back in a year from now and see like what's left over, or what's still standing from the COP29.
And those are great insights. We also have a poster presentation exhibit later, and one of them is definitely talking about like Azerbaijan and host country dynamics. So if you're interested in learning more about that, that'd be a great spot to like talk to our delegates more about that. So coming to the content of COP negotiations this year, finance was a really big focus. Like a lot of people called COP29 the finance COP. And while a lot of key developments took place on establishing frameworks for carbon markets and developing like the new collective quantified goal, consensus was difficult to find. The COP was prolonged by over 33 hours. So what were some challenges raised regarding, say, equity in finance that led to this standstill? You can like also hop around, like if somebody else wants to start, that's completely fine.
I can try to start. I did not get to spend too much time in the negotiation room, so I was following a few of them. And I think, especially from an equity standpoint, there are a few points I'd like to bring up. First, a lot of nations are represented in the G77, and that includes China, a lot of large nations, and then also a lot of small developing nations. And I think within that, from speaking with a few delegates, they were honestly stopping a lot of the negotiations by saying they weren't ready because they had to coordinate so many nations. So they would put blocks while other people were talking to try to slow the negotiations down. Some people were telling us that that's a negotiating tactic to try to get what they want, because a lot of those are like industrializing nations trying to kind of allow themselves to industrialize, as a lot of the developed nations have been able to, like the US, and pollute a lot, but now they're like reaping the benefits of that. And also a lot of those nations are the developing nations that don't really get a lot of say in those groups. And I think they're really calling for more of an equitable, justice-based approach because their nations really need that the most. And I think a question that really came up for me were these negotiations creating systems like the carbon markets that had holes in them, and is that good enough? Like, is it okay that we're creating these systems that kind of let negative consequences happen? And yes, I think it's positive that these things are moving forward to create some kind of momentum in the climate space when it is so urgent, but also if it's not a complete kind of holistic, equitable approach, is it really going to work in the end? And I think a lot of the small nations and the developing nations are really bringing light to that and calling to that, saying that these approaches aren't really going to help them. So I think that slowed the negotiations down a little bit too.
Yeah, I remember reading your notes for like the justice thing, and I remember you putting it very well. Like, is it better to have a flawed system than no system at all? And I think that's very interesting to think about.
I think going off of what Leanne said, I think some of the financial issues and the financial divides that come between developed countries and developing countries in the COP context come up in a lot of other areas of international development, and it's this idea of smaller nations and developing nations calling on these international mechanisms to help them confront these larger issues, but then developed countries sort of having this unwillingness to fully help, and so there are these complex loan arrangements. Even with the loss and damage fund, it's operationalized by the World Bank, which is part of these larger issues. And so it is this question of, are we just creating more debt and creating more institutional barriers and challenges for developing countries to resolve some of these issues? And I think like what Leanne said, the developing countries did really make a push this COP and in recent COPs for a more equity-based system, and thinking about these institutional challenges, and thinking about their development more holistically, about how they need to address some of these climate challenges imminently, but there are also these barriers that some of these existing solutions are creating. Because even with past COPs, with a focus being on mitigation being creating technologies to combat climate change actively, it kind of puts certain countries that don't have the technical capability to do that on the sidelines. But I think some of these fundamental disconnects about how the climate change crisis needs to be solved, how should foreign aid even work, I think really comes to the spotlight, especially when you're branding it as a finance COP and you're not really looking deeper into what those issues are coming from. And I think that's where things slowed down a lot in the negotiations, and a lot of that disagreement came up from the global south versus industrialized countries.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, you mentioned finance, and a word that came into my mind immediately was the market. At the time, there was a lot of uncertainty regarding U.S. election results.
You know what? We're switching up our order, not at this time.
You can talk at the same time. I think what really stood out to me was the sort of political and economic dynamic within the pavilions between other countries, not just the US, but maybe sort of powerhouses within the climate sphere, like China, the EU, some developing nations coming up with very innovative solutions in Southeast Asia. I think it was really interesting to see how those countries and maybe some businesses and organizations were pivoting their strategy or adapting to this new political landscape, trying to adjust to changes. So I think in that sense, it was really interesting to see how maybe like flows of finance or how some markets are structured are being changed, and it was really interesting to sort of follow that whole process during my week there. I don't want to say too much. But yeah, like I think an example that I had in mind was, so back in South Korea, we have an emissions trading system where you can trade carbon credits and things like that as a private sector business. And it was really interesting to see how Korea was actually changing the competitive rules and how the ETS was being regulated to fit EU regulations, while it was previously based on sort of the US ETS system. So that change itself just tells me a lot about how, oh, maybe the US election results has a sort of ripple effect in the global economy as well, not just within the country like domestically, but in a global stage like COP. So
You can steal my full answers, that's okay. We had, prior to us going there, we had the opportunity, we have one of the delegates from the United States was part of, she went to Boston College, her name's Catherine, and we got the opportunity to sit with her, and I think one of the cool, one of the unique things that she said to me that stood out, she was like, we're trying to stay away from this idea that this is a finance COP. I don't know if you guys remember that statement. For me, I was like, whoa, why, what's going on, like what's the reason behind it? And I think there was some uncertainty on her level of like, how's it gonna go? Are we gonna stay in the Paris Agreement? You know, there was still Trump and Harris, it was like a week away, I believe was when we talked to her. So there's some uncertainty when we got there. I had the opportunity to have dinner with one of the Algerian delegates, and she was highlighting the concern that she had. She's like, I don't know where we're gonna get this funding, Trump's got elected, even if we come to an agreement, how realistic is it gonna stay? So I think there was a lot more uncertainty in the air that perhaps some people did not want to talk about specifically. And also during the time, not many US leaders like had come to the conference. There was the G77 conference going on, even was in Brazil. Could be wrong about the location, but I think that also kind of had an impact to show like people perhaps weren't as serious about the finance COP. And I think that was kind of like a little sad to hear that like it wasn't as a big priority for some of these larger countries.
I think it's interesting you bring up like leaders, and also I know some of you mentioned that it almost seemed like there was a rush to get money out of the door because they didn't know necessarily how long they were going to have control. But I think the US is still going to be at the next COP because I think just based on the NFCCC rules, like they need a 1-year notice. But again, I think funds are still under control of the Trump administration. So
I do want to say, while we were at the conference, I was following like countries, like I think France and Algeria pulled their delegation from the COP, like halfway through it, and I thought that was a really big factor showing like some countries weren't as committed as we believed that they were. So that was something that like, I also was following on the side.
interesting. Okay. Also, speaking of leaders and all like political leaders and climate leaders and activists, I remember last COP, one of the coolest experiences was getting like a front seat at a talk by Al Gore, and he was talking about climate change. We got to see, I think Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris during like a panel on women, gender, and climate, which was super interesting. So, just out of curiosity, did you guys get to see any famous climate leaders or political leaders in Azerbaijan, and who was the most fun to catch, or like what was your craziest encounter?
Yeah.
I think I mean, I saw a lot of very famous people. I think.
I'm not good like that.
Okay. I
Can't
think
even think of a name.
meeting.
They don't mind though.
I think meeting BC alumni at COP was a very good experience. Prime example, we saw Senator Ed Markey, double eagle, BA, JD, you know, and we were at this talk at the US Pavilion with him and I forget his name, but the senator of Rhode Island as well. They were talking about how to navigate this whole new sort of climate political landscape. And afterwards, me, Liz, and Gustavo, we got a picture with the senator. It was super cool. It's all over my LinkedIn. It was really funny.
I'm pretty sure it's on one of the posters.
Yeah, I think it's on the posters.
Definitely find it.
Shout out Senator Ed Markey.
I didn't get any cool opportunities to meet any excessive world leaders, unfortunately. I think one of the cool things that I got to enjoy is we sat in on I'm an engineer by trade, and one of the cool things we sat in on a conference that they were using AI to kind of predict next level like floodings. And while this person wasn't perhaps a leader by any stretch, it was kind of cool to see the advancements that all of us kind of talk about in our day-to-day, that's like AI and ChatGPT and kind of like the implementation of it moving forward. So I met AI at that conference. That's as close as I could get.
Yeah, okay. Do you think your experience has changed your perspective on international climate policy and climate action, and did it influence your future aspirations in any way?
I think definitely I was a little disheartened to see kind of the methods in which they are trying to solve climate change. And these policies coming from a global health perspective, and I feel like our public health program here really does center justice and equity. I feel like they're trying to solve within international issues in solve things in a very pragmatic way, when I think we need much more creative and equitable solutions. I especially think they're trying to solve kind of an issue created by capitalism in a capitalistic format, and I think that just creates, it's just going to continue creating more issues. And as long as we really rely on this kind of system of exploitation, I don't really know if any progress will truly continue. So I think, coming from a background of studying public health, art, and kind of justice, I do really want to continue to go into policy, but I think I want to go into policy that really fights against that system in a way, and doesn't just kind of like comply and try to work within it, because I really don't think we'll find a sustainable solution within it.
Yeah, I think after COP, I came away with more questions than answers in terms of what needs to be done in terms of having a human rights-based approach to addressing climate change. And that's sort of the lens I came into this work with, but I think even after COP, it's become more pressing to think about the ways in which we need to apply human rights principles in climate change, and then even with the climate change solutions that are being implemented, ensuring that human rights are being protected. So a lot of the work that I've been doing in this past semester since coming back from COP, I've been writing a law review note about climate risk disclosure rules. I'm writing a different report for the special rapporteur in the Human Rights Clinic, and I keep wanting to put a footnote, like I was at COP 29, just trust me, like this is where everything is coming from. And I think COP really brought all of that together for me in terms of all the different stakeholders involved, like I've said, but also just thinking really critically in terms of what solutions are going to work in terms of, yes, addressing climate change, but actually helping the people that are affected by climate change and climate change solutions both, because that could raise other human rights issues, other institutional challenges that we may not be realizing right now when we're just solely focused on trying to just address climate issues that are in front of us.
Yeah, I think attending COP really added layers and layers of new perspectives and ways to look at things more critically for me. I went into this with a sort of more finance, investment heavy background, being an economics major. And I had this one conversation with a representative from a private equity firm in the pavilions, and I asked him, how is his business handling this whole new divestment concept? And he actually thinks a counter argument for divestment could be the fact that divestment leads to detachment, and in turn that's sort of loss of control for shareholders. So is divestment really the best way to go? Maybe you need to, if anything, gain more control over business decisions and sort of have dominance within the room, with the board. And that was just sort of an interesting perspective. I don't know the answer, whether that's right or wrong, but that was an interesting perspective coming into it, and I think that really stood out to me, how different industries, different sectors, different professionals are looking at this whole issue. And I think as someone going into sort of corporate ethics, corporate sustainability, I think that's a perspective, a new perspective that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life as I navigate my career.
For me, coming into this conference, I think I was expecting first time I was like, oh no, they're gonna change the world, it's the UN, that they cannot go wrong. But it was seeing how different people, different countries were coming in. The US had one perspective, even though they knew what perhaps China and Russia, Azerbaijan were living, they didn't seem like it was on the same page of trying to make a path forward. It was more so I want to push my agenda, It was a little disheartening. And it kind of inspired me to be maybe it's time to get a bit more involved. I'm an engineering major, which means I don't like people. Straight up. Don't like politics, don't want to deal with it. And being part of it, I was like, no, this is perhaps the time where we really need to get a little bit more involved. So it did kind of encourage me to say, perhaps it's a chance for me to get a little bit more involved and start focusing a little bit more on getting into politics and having a deeper understanding of where people are trying to come from and working towards that. So this conference kind of definitely opened up my eyes, and now I can start talking to people. So
Thanks, guys. And I'm sure some people in the room have this question, and maybe one or two of you can respond to it. So how does one go about becoming a COP delegate? What did the application process look like, and how did you prepare for it going into the conference?
If I remember correctly, I think anyone who's a BC student, undergrad or grad, can apply. And
Faculty too.
oh, faculty as well.
Yeah,
So
okay.
you could apply. It's every year. And it was like a first round where there was a Google form that you filled out, and then a second round where you had to
Respond to
oh yes, respond to the questions on a Google form. But I really think if you're passionate about environmental health, human rights, justice, and learning more about how this process works, just talking about your passions and being honest about what you want to get out of it, and like bringing your unique perspective. As I said earlier, I study art, and I think I talked about that a lot in my application about how I wanted to learn how like art as a communication method, especially in this time of people feeling so oversaturated by how much is going on in the world, and like people are just not caring. So I think if you feel like you have a unique perspective to bring, which I think everyone does, to really highlight that.
I'll say something.
I think it's really important to sort of, so the COP program is ran through the Schiller Institute, and Schiller Institute values the interdisciplinary studies a lot. And I think that's sort of what makes our COP29 delegation special. When I first applied, I was talking about like economics and all of that in my essays, but later on I realized that once I joined the delegation, we had people from public health, law, business, engineering, philosophy, a lot of different backgrounds, and I think that's what makes it special, right? Like coming in with different sort of backgrounds and maybe values even, expertise, and making it diverse is what's important. So I think for if any of you are considering applying, like I feel like that's something to understand. You don't have to be super well versed in climate science or anything like that. So yeah.
You also take a class to prep
Right,
for it too.
yeah.
So
just by a show of hands, how many people have not been to the COP conference here? So all of you guys are perfect candidates. Katie would not let us come back for a second time, unfortunately. So I think the cool opportunity was I came from the Kyoto School of Management, had no idea what the Schiller Institute was until I got the email. I apologize for that, but really cool opportunity. They talked about the Google Forms. You do have to take a class. I believe there might be some changes to the program next year. Not too sure what they will end up doing with that, but I think the main thing is if you're passionate and you know what you want to get out of the conference, like they will work with you. Unless you're Praveen, you can only go once. It's my understanding. So not to call them out, but
You have to ask the Schiller Institute.
but really, I think if you really want to go and you really want to work with them, it can happen. You just need to apply, and then maybe slide Katie $200 would be fine.
We'll open it up to the floor for questions. Gladly.
So I have a question about the Faith Pavilion. It was opened last year, so this was the second year that the Faith Pavilion was there. And I'd like to preface my question with a quote. This is from Gus Stepp. He said, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation." And your point specifically was the system is broken. And so coming from a Catholic university and knowing that Pope Francis has been very forceful in his statements about care for creation, care for our common home, how can your experience at COP bring that moral voice of faith to the conversation in all of those negotiations. Because that was what turned Pope Francis in the first place, when he understood the amazing injustice that the poor are the ones suffering the most from climate change. And the rich nations are just saying, fine with me.
Well, that's a great question, and thank you for asking. I think within the conference, one of the delegates told us was kind of how within the negotiations, sometimes there's not a lot of space for conversations like that because they're kind of predetermined, and as we mentioned before, a lot of the richer nations kind of like have the floor and are controlling the nations or controlling the negotiations, but it's really like the outside, like the rest of the pavilions in the blue zone and in the green zone, and the conversations around it and the protests, and those kind of conversations slowly trickle in to the negotiations. So I think here on a Jesuit campus, and people who are really trying to come from a faith perspective just need to speak up more. And as Pope Francis is speaking up, I think that's really helpful. But I think even like here at BC, it's kind of like hush hush sometimes around the environmental conversations. And I think from a moral perspective, like this is a moral imperative. Like people are dying, and it's an issue that reaches everyone in the world. But obviously, as you mentioned, like the poor are suffering the most, women are suffering the most, like the vulnerable populations, the ones with the least power are suffering the most. So I think coming from a Jesuit institution, like, and coming from a place of privilege, like we need to speak up more about it and like bring voices to that. And I think the louder we are, the more that trickles into where it matters in the negotiations.
Thank you for your question, and that's a really interesting question. Also something that I've been thinking about as well, because as much as you call something the finance COP, or you brand it by the global stocktake or these quantified goals, it's just where's the humanity in some of these discussions. And even from a human rights perspective, right, what I'm personally studying right now is some of the human rights that are violated by climate change, and one of the ones we talk about is the right to culture and the right to spiritual development as a fundamental human right that everyone should have. And I think some of those perspectives are lost in those negotiating rooms, and it's actually being brought up, I think, slowly from a wide range of belief systems, especially even from indigenous communities as well, of the land being a basis for their spirituality and for their culture, and their connection to their land is part of who they are, and that identity. And so I think there is starting to be more of a push for encouraging some of these cultural and faith-based conversations in climate, but there needs to be a lot more room for that. And I think there needs to be more of this understanding of, yes, these are the pragmatic solutions and these financial incentives that could help resolve this crisis, but at the end of the day, it's affecting humans in all forms of life, including in their cultural and spiritual development, and you need to have solutions that are geared towards that as well.
I'm gonna go first. For me, I practice Islam as my religion, and one of the things I noticed at the conference, Azerbaijan is a predominantly Muslim nation, but they're Shia. And one of the things, I didn't think about it until now that you mentioned it, they did have a prayer room, but it was like tucked in the back of the conference, which is kind of like, we kind of highlighted, like, we don't really talk about it in the faith community and everything. It kind of feel like a dirty little secret, like just in the back. You get to walk quite a bit, you get to ask the directions for it. So in terms of like the faith aspect, while I do believe that there were a lot of people there who have their own beliefs and have their own thing, but I didn't feel like I saw it on the floor. You didn't see people sitting there being like very honest and very upfront. Like there was definitely like, you could see like some hands in the background. It's kind of sad. I think coming from a Jesuit institute, and trying to be honest, trying to help your fellow man and woman, for all things of that nature, I think it's a really interesting question, and I would have to take some more time to think about it, but I definitely, you could tell like it was just hidden in the back in terms of the religion, and that's coming from quote unquote like an Islamic nation within there. And the fact they had the room was probably a good sign, but it also means that how often are we as human beings really sitting there thinking about our faith and our beliefs and implementing it in our day-to-day interactions. I know politics is not probably the best in terms of politics and being faithful to whatever they say, but it's a very interesting question that I think we got to dive a little bit deeper into. You have anything to add? I took your word. Just a minute. Yes.
It's a continue on from the question. The Faith Pavilion, can you say a little bit, was it sponsored by one faith, or was it all faiths were welcome to present something? Or, I mean, at the core, most faiths have a lot of common denominators, one of which is care for the earth, right? So I'm just curious how the pavilion manifested itself.
Did any of you
This gentleman asked about it.
get the chance to visit the Faith
Just like to
Pavilion?
clarify, like when you say the Faith Pavilion, is there like an organization called Faith? Or
No, there is a pavilion called the Faith
The Faith
Pavilion.
Pavilion.
Yep.
I feel like COP is pretty vast, so I'm not sure if you had the chance to visit, but
So
Maybe I should ask you.
No, I didn't go.
I walked by the Faith Pavilion. It did feel like everybody was represented. You had Christians, Jews, Islam. When I went there, it wasn't as busy. I feel like some people probably said I was stepping out for lunch, so perhaps it was completely wrong time on my behalf, and I fully admit that. So I apologize, I'm not the best to answer this question for that. But the pavilion itself, it was around like it was in the blue zone next to
Okay.
all the country pavilions. So they did have a presence there, but like again to reiterate the point, I didn't feel like it was a big like nobody was sitting there like, oh yeah, we're gonna go talk to we're gonna go talk to the priest, or we're gonna go talk to like these scholars about these issues, like Imam or whatever. Like it was definitely more so. Everybody was more focused on, hey, how much money are we gonna get? Hey, like what are the carbon markets doing? Hey, what's going on with like politics, and what's the U.S. doing now with Trump? Like there was a lot more going on in the environment. Perhaps it was not the best, right, for us like coming from this standpoint. But to your point, unfortunately, it was there. I can confirm it was there. I don't have a picture, but I can promise it was there. For all of that.
If I may chime in, I was at the Faith Pavilion at COP26 as part of a privilege to be on the first BC delegation, and it was quite busy and it was really interfaith, so there were good discussions. But some other pavilions are bigger, the EU pavilion, the US pavilion, etc. But it was of considerable size and importance and good discussions.
Ask the gentleman in the back. Seems very knowledgeable.
I think we might have time for one more question.
Yeah, by short introduction, I'm Kurt. I'm in the Global Public Health Program. I had the privilege to be in the first BC delegation. I was most disappointed about the outcomes, and I'm even more disappointed at the outcomes of the Baku. I was since at all the different ones, either as a virtual observer or in person, including at the subsidiary body meetings that take place in Bonn every summer in June. And my main focus is I'm from the health community. I'm working with many organizations there. We want to bring health forward to the front table and to the negotiation table with a strategy in our belief that we think if we bring forward the health arguments, we perhaps come up with more ambitious and more successful negotiations, because this is what impacts us. So with that introduction, my question is, how much was health a topic there? Was it discussed in any of the issues? Obviously, it's clear to the question is.
If there's anything that unites us, it should be our health.
Thank you for the question. I think at this COP, at least the negotiations that I was following, health was really not the top of mind. It's kind of very pushed under the rug, and I think, as you mentioned, if it was brought to the forefront, I think people would kind of realize more of what's happening. And I think something that really struck me about health in general within the negotiations is the burden of proof of it causing health, as we talk about in the Global Public Health Program. Like in the United States, we force this burden of proof onto children that are dying from chemicals just to get these chemicals banned, and that same burden of proof is being forced onto nations who they're going through famine, their diseases, the communicable diseases are increasing, their water supplies are being contaminated, and I think because health is not at the forefront of really any of the negotiations, and when it is at the forefront, the people that are most vulnerable have to prove what's happening. with technology that usually they do not have. I think that really, creates a sense of non-urgency in these negotiations and allows countries where these issues are not as kind of top of mind to really, again, control the conversations. So yeah, I was very disappointed to see that health and kind of like the stark statistics are not really brought up and not discussed.
I think just to sort of add on, I'm in this class called Environment and Health right now with Professor Severini, and one thing that stands out to me is health effects can sometimes go unnoticed for a long period of time. So especially when you're talking about things like pollution, PM 2.5, PM 10 pollution, these health effects maybe leading to, I don't know, like infant mortality, it doesn't show until a certain period of time. But the research is there, and I definitely resonate with your point. I think it's almost hinging on the scientific community to sort of raise more awareness with the research that's happening and that's already present, and sort of making sure that it translates into policy and enters those discussion rooms. Because yes, at COP29 it wasn't at the forefront of the discussion, but I do think health should be. And yes, there are immediate sort of effects to health too, and it's just as if people are not noticing that. Yeah, with the pandemic too. So
I was checking because I remember seeing health on one of the days. It was actually the same day as the children and youth involvement. That was the day I got to go to the Blue Zone, so I should be the one to answer this, but I completely apologize because I prioritize the children activism. I think just based on the class and like having the youth more involved, those were discussions that I was more interested in. I will say health did play an impact. There were some conversations related around health and focus on that, but to most of our points, it was not the forefront of it. But I think subconsciously is all thinking about it in the background, like how like financially, like how are these countries comfortable, right? Like world leaders being able to support their people. I think one of the big things in terms of health, when I sat down with the Algerian delegate, she was very concerned about her people. She was like, yeah, we can't industrialize as quickly or as rapidly as we want because we have people who are starving, people who are doing this. Like, what do we prioritize our renewable energies and maintaining like the Paris Agreement? So do we prioritize feeding our people? That's a tough balance, and I can't speak to what's the correct way to do that. But I do think health was in the background of everybody's mind at the conference.
Just to add on to that a little bit, I think anytime I saw health mentioned was in an economic perspective, as in the countries kind of had to monetize their losses, like monetizing how much it would mean for their people to die. So they're kind of like, again, taking these issues and they have to translate it into an economic perspective for the other nations to even care. And I think, as Junsu mentioned, like the importance of research on what's happening is, I mean, it's very important, but I think there's enough research. Like, we already have the research to show what is happening. Like, we don't need every country to be able to prove how much their country's being affected. Like, we already know millions and millions of people are dying from this. How much more do we need? Like, I think them to keep placing the burden onto these nations and onto scientists to continue to prove something that's been proven time and time again is just a tactic to slow the negotiations down. Like, there's enough health proof to show what's happening and the egregious things that are happening to people all around the world. Like, they don't need more. And I think them saying they need more, again, as I said, is just slowing things down.
Thanks, Leanne.
If I just may very briefly, that's what was very well said, but we don't need to show that tobacco smoking causes lung cancer in Rwanda or any other place. We know it's causing lung cancer, and the same is true for the climate change and health. Just as a background, at the COP28, as you probably remember, we had the first ever health day, and we did not put a lot of hope into the COP29. But we're all mobilizing for the COP30 in Belém, where we hope that health will again be on the forefront. So whoever is interested in climate change and health, happy to talk and also give an overview of what's going on.
Thank you so much.
By the way, COP26 was the first time when COP conference had a dedicated pavilion on
A health pavilion,
Yeah,
which was not called WHO pavilion, interestingly.
which is not, well, Maria has hijacked that.
Yeah, absolutely.
May I
I just wanted to ask a quick question if I may. Sorry. Oh, will you speak? Will you
Yeah,
speak?
I was about to ask a question.
I have my hand up then.
I had my hand
But you
up
had
even
your-
before, so.
Oh, go ahead.
Just in case.
Yeah.
But since you're the Schiller director.
No, I just thought I was.
Hey, I need to lubricate all of these things. But my question is very straightforward, and I'll give you a hint of the possible answer that you can actually go ahead and do. Yes, no. For Sangeeta, I take the Fifth Amendment and I don't want to decline. I want to decline, and so on and so forth. The question is, based on your engagement with the climate COP conferences, your discussions with so many other dignitaries we met at COP, the classes that we did, and so on and so forth. What's your feeling? What do you think? Should BC divest from fossil fuel investments?
Oh my God.
Nailing it down.
Yes.
Well, wait. What about this idea that Junsu was saying? I think
Yeah, that's
The deeper and.
that maybe it makes sense to get deeper involved in the company versus
Change
then
the
getting out of it. That's a new way to look at it, right? Have you?
I think that is a new way to look at it, but I don't think it's not going to do
I
anything.
would disagree.
You don't think it's going to do anything?
I
People have
don't.
been doing this for decades.
I'm asking their opinion, you know?
The
You guys
Sisters
have
of
been
Mercy
thinking
have
about
been
it.
investing their funds that way for quite a while. They invest and they go to stock over here.
I have been asked to also very closely.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to do anything.
No.
No, it shouldn't.
You gave me one word. No.
Yes.
Oh.
If you want to ask further, come ask me after.
Right now, yes.
Okay, I'll plead
I'll plead the
fifth.
fifth.
I'll plead the fifth.
I said 100% yes.
But Sangeeta, you first said yes, and now
And I
you.
said yes. No, I believe yes, and then you can talk to me about it. But
Well, thank you so much for your questions.
No,
This was fun.
There's another question from Laura.
Yes, Laura.
Laura.
Thank you, but I know we have a time.
We
have
do
no
have a little
we-
bit of
we-
short-
We eat a little bit faster.
We can have a question
there's
just
people on-
for you, Laura.
Oh,
We can carry this
My
conversation,
question
so
was
we are
to be
breaking for
actually-
lunch, and we can carry the conversations over the
We'll
lunch
stay out
table
here.
too. So they'll be around, you can come up and ask. Thank you so much for joining us for the panel today. And thank you guys for being on the panel. Honestly, it's been such a pleasure working with the COP29 delegation, all of you guys, but also the other incredible people. They have such cool interests, and they're such great people to talk to. I feel like I went to COP28, and I feel like every conversation I've had with them has added so much more to my perspective too. So I highly recommend you using the time between 1:30 to 3 when they'll be presenting their insights here to go up and talk to them. They are more than happy to talk, and they have such great insights, truly. Thank you for joining us.